Longer will the remaining old movie houses stand. The Dixie in Ruston features live music now. It will stand a while longer. When we finally come to notice these landmarks are threatened, people do often come together to save them. So it is in another part of this town. People have begun to care about a special place some here still remember as a lesson in harmony. Ruston, Louisiana is a town with a unique connection to the last World War. Look closely at a few old barracks still standing on the outskirts of town. They're remnants of an unusually close encounter with the enemy.
They were just as nice as they could be to me. They would meet me, and it was Guten Morgen, you know. And sometimes they'd stop and try to talk to me in German. And occasionally they would come in with some flowers they had grown over in the compound and present them to me, come to the lab and hand them to me.
Mary Ducheney remembers when she nursed the sick at Camp Ruston. American soldiers and alongside them the German prisoners they guarded here for more than 2 years. Do you recognize the place? There are only 2 small buildings left. And I know there were dozens and dozens of barracks for 5,000 prisoners.
Yes, there was. And it doesn't look the same, certainly not. I remember that these look like the barracks, but as far as knowing where they were, or whether this was the hospital lab, or whether it was administrative building, or whether it was just a ward, I have no way of knowing. And all the buildings then looked the same anyway.
You know something? You don't remember the buildings and you don't remember the layout of the camp, but you do remember the people.
Unsere beiden Schatten sahen wie ein Haus, dass wir lieb uns hatten, das sah man gleich daraus.
It was a world of watchtowers and barbed wire, mess halls and nightly card games, a PX where German prisoners could buy a Coca-Cola. Soldiers who once fought for world domination were rewarded with 700 fenced-in acres in North Louisiana, a government P.O.W. camp like 510 other ones in America. But this camp was in Ruston, and that somehow made it different. A hemisphere away, the battles roared. In North Africa, Field Marshal Ernst Rommel steamrolled over miles of sandy desert. His Africa Corps was the pride of the Nazi war machine. Rommel was even regarded by the British troops he fought as a gentleman soldier. But gentility was hardly the way of Hitler's strategist. By the time the U.S. entered the fray, German submarines were sinking our supply ships to Britain and Africa. In no time at all, the war was in full production. On the home front, we learned that the Nazis, who some in America had admired, were bloody thugs bent on domination. That fear of Germans was strengthened by wartime caricatures of leering, bloodthirsty Huns. The enemy was ruthless, craven, giant, and evil, and everyone knew it. But they were not invincible, as time and again Allied offensive hemmed up thousands of captured troops. Rommel's Africa Corps was decimated. These tank gunners and infantrymen were shipped to camps in the States. By train, the Africa Corps traveled into the heartland. Last stop for some, Camp Ruston, where they were fingerprinted, cleaned up, and searched.
Several times we would come by to pick up freight or something and have 3 or 4 of them on the back of a truck with a guard. And we stop back by the house and drink coffee, and nobody ever complained about it. And none of them ever tried to escape.
John Gay was assigned 2 German helpers at the camp store.
They knew they couldn't get away anyhow, so they didn't want to lay out anymore. I imagine they had a kind of rough time in North Africa. They'd had enough. But I'll tell you this, from what I saw, they had little or no respect for their officers. We had, one time, had a diphtheria shots they were giving the officers, giving all of them. And several of the officers, I imagine seemed like about 20 of them refused to have the shot. So they walked them down in front of the exchanges, and the boys hung on the fence and jeered them all the way down there to the hospital. They forced them to take that shot.
They done their own cooking. They made their own bread and everything.
Harold Buckland guarded the Germans on trips into town and took them on work details as an MP.
Was to bring in their grub, and they made their own. Boy, they made good stuff, I'm telling you. When I come in there, Harold, he couldn't say Harold. Come on. And I go over there, they have a big square can like that of coffee and a big hunk of bread and butter. Boy, I stayed there.
But you were the guard. They had better food than in the Army?
Better than we had.
For all the propaganda we had absorbed, this was a turning point in blind hatred. Many families had reason to hate, but these Huns, for a few people in Ruston, now had faces, normal, even nice-looking faces. And by all accounts, most of the enemy were not only clean and friendly, they were smart and even polite.
There was a lot of propaganda, and the radio and the newsreels, and in school.
Ruston native Ruth Futrell was 14 when she saw her first German.
My best friend and I were standing on the platform downtown Ruston. Her name was Sue Matthews, waiting for the train to go, and it was going by real slow, and there were open box cars, and we realized that these were German POWs, and we knew about the camp, but we'd of course never been out, but we knew that it was there. And we just got real still, and all of a sudden, all of these boys started calling and waving and smiling, and we just waved and smiled back. It just seemed like the thing to do. And the train went by very slow, and I don't remember how many cars of POWs there were, but it seemed like a lot of them at the time. But we had been watching all through the war the newsreels at the movies and the radio, of course. And our idea of Germans was the Nazis, you know, and we were the good guys. But here, all these sweet-faced young boys go by just smiling and waving like, and it just kind of stunned us. And after they went by, we wondered how they were being taken care of out here. We wondered how they were treated.
Sag mir adieu, frag nicht und geh.
Camp Ruston was known as an anti-Nazi camp, a place where ordinary soldiers were safe from hardliners and ultra-patriots of the fatherland. If there were political fights in these ranks, the Americans didn't hear of it.
I could take 4 prisoners and go anywhere in the United States here with them and that have no trouble. What let them, that was overcost, was injured, when they come back over here, they wanted to kill the Germans.
Germans were good fellows, they were all right. They had a German cook for the officers' mess down there that sent cakes home to my wife all the time. They were real good.
Sent cakes to your wife?
Yeah. She patched clothes and stuff for them when they needed sewing, and so they sent cakes to her.
They worked in the fields around North Louisiana, picking peaches and chopping lumber. When they were hired out to pick cotton, black children were not allowed to watch. Remember, this was 1944, and that wasn't proper work for white men.
So we had one that escaped, I think, on a regular basis about once a month, and they'd pick him up in different places. In fact, I think he'd call up and tell them, I'm over at so-and-so, and they'd go get him, bring him back. I believe it was 2 who escaped and went all the way to Ringo and got out there, and it was cold and icy, and they was about to freeze to death, and they turned themselves in over there and came back to camp. They had visions, he said, of going into Mexico and getting home. All they wanted was to go home.
Theater groups of POWs? Yes, and they built models and baked pastries to sell in town. They made small castles in front of their barracks. They sketched their new quarters and drew a snow-covered home life to remind them of a country that by war's end they would hardly recognize. Munich's Olympic Stadium marked the entrance to this barracks. The men were even allowed to send this photo home as a Christmas card. In classrooms, they mastered government-taught democracy, free enterprise, and another language.
When we are marching in the mud and cold, and when my pack seems more than I can hold.
Even over in the compound, I never heard about any fighting or anything over there. They seemed to try to make the best of what they had. And except for the fact that they missed their loved ones back home, I think they were happy to be here because they weren't fighting. Their lives were not at risk, and they were well taken care of.
When one prisoner died, there was no German flag to drape his coffin. A woman in Ruston even sewed an enemy flag for this stranger's coffin. Certainly an extraordinary show of compassion.
They kept their barracks immaculate. A lot of the Red Cross reports that we found in the archives records indicate that the inspectors were amazed that the grounds were immaculate. You could eat off the ground and things like that. And this is just indicative of that. They came in and made a place for themselves to live.
Today, the secrets of Camp Ruston can be literally uncovered. Just dig down 6 inches. Mark Scalia is a history student at Louisiana Tech.
Some people remember this. Some people are fascinated by the cultural exchange between 19-year-old German youths that were in the Africa Corps, they were in the U-boat Corps, you know, very stark reminders of the German military in Ruston, Louisiana. I mean, the social implications are staggering when you understand that you have people that were brought up under the guise of Adolf Hitler, brought to rural north central Louisiana. And that's very intriguing in how the two areas adapted to one another.
What are you looking for?
What else can tell us what these guys did behind barbed wire? As we expanded that, we went further back and found what we term the patios. There are brick landings that are laid out, one in a herringbone fashion, one straight crisscross fashion, that coincide with the measurements of the building. And the implication, of course, is they built these things to make their barracks look nice. We found one in this barrack. To about 30 feet over, we found one in front of the other barrack. And it gives you a pattern. It shows you how these people lived. We hope to recreate that whole atmosphere by going all the way through this and finding perhaps more castles, a stadium, anything that says, hey, I was made by a German 47 years ago.
Right at that crossroad is where the double gate was, and the fences ran along this line here.
Vince Spione is eager to tell the true story of Camp Ruston. He's organized as much memorabilia and as many of the old stories as he can. People with stories to tell are starting to come forward now.
It's not unusual, for example, for me to sit in my office and get a phone call and say there's an ex-P.O.W. up front, and they come back to see where they were kept. I don't imagine people who would have bad experiences want to bring their families and take pictures and almost come back like it's a Disneyland. They come back and they have good stories. They sit down and have picnics with their families and tell us about their experiences at Camp Ruston. Just recently we had an Italian prisoner came back by himself. And I think one of the interesting things about his story is, and he told us as he left here, save those 2 buildings, there's nothing else left. He had gone to the other camps that he was kept. There is nothing left, and this is one of the few things in the United States that's left. If you think about, and you ask yourself this question, how many sites for World War II are on American soil? There are very few. Pearl Harbor, there are sure some others, but here's one also, and that's what we're trying to tell the story of.
That's one thing we can be proud of, in my opinion. You may not share it, but I think we can be proud of the fact that we took soldiers that had fought our boys and possibly had killed some of them and treated them humanely and well. I've seen them come in.
Society is judged by the depth of its humanity, the charity we showed?
We did not try to do what the Germans were doing or the powers that be to them. I understand that our boys weren't treated that well, but we treated them with kindness and consideration for the most part.
There are many more stories about ordinary life and some not-so-ordinary tales of how 2 warring cultures got along here. If the measure of a society is the depth of its compassion, there may be an enduring lesson to be found in so small a corner of this warring world.